A lonely mountain man found 3 women in his bear trap. We were running from our wedding, they said. In the Colorado Territory, a hermit trapper discovers 3 women half frozen in the wilderness. They claim they escaped their weddings, but powerful men don't let valuable prizes slip away easily. Soon, federal marshals hunt the mountain, calling the trapper a kidnapper and the women stolen property. The corrupt judge, ruthless rancher, and predatory businessman who lost their brides have everyone convinced this is a rescue mission. But when water means power and marriage means ownership, sometimes becoming an outlaw is the only way to stay alive. What secrets are 3 wedding dresses worth killing for? And when the hunters close in, who's really the prey? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The bitter wind howled through the mountain peaks like a wounded animal, whipping snow and ice into stinging clouds that cut visibility to mere feet. Nathaniel Porter pulled his wool scarf tighter around his weathered face as he trudged through knee-deep drifts, checking his trap lines as he did every day, blizzard or no. 5 years of living alone in these mountains had taught him that routine was what kept a man sane, kept him moving forward when grief threatened to freeze him in place like the icicles hanging from the pines. The temperature had dropped sharply since dawn, and his bones told him it would only get worse as night approached. His leather boots crunched through the crusty top layer of snow as he made his way to the furthest trap, the one set in a natural game trail near the edge of his property. The wind changed direction suddenly, and through its mournful keening, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A cry. Human. Desperate. Nathaniel's heart began to pound. He hadn't heard another human voice in months, not since his last supply run to the trading post. The sound came again, clearer this time, multiple voices calling for help. He quickened his pace, following the sounds until he reached his largest bear trap. What he saw there nearly stopped his heart. 3 women, huddled together in torn and muddied wedding dresses, their feet caught in the metal jaws of his trap. Their faces were pale as the snow around them, lips tinged with blue, bodies racked with violent shivering. "Dear God in heaven," Nathaniel breathed, dropping to his knees beside them. The eldest of the 3, a woman with striking features and intelligent eyes, tried to speak through chattering teeth. "Please, help us." "Don't try to talk yet, ma'am," Nathaniel said gruffly, already working at the trap's mechanism with fingers numbed by cold. "Gotta get you free first." The metal springs were frozen nearly solid, but Nathaniel knew every inch of his traps. With careful pressure and a strength born of years working these mountains, he managed to release the jaws. The women's feet were bleeding, their fancy wedding shoes torn to shreds. Without hesitation, Nathaniel shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat. "Here," he said, wrapping it around all 3 women. The youngest looked barely conscious, her head lolling against the shoulder of the eldest. "Can you walk?" he asked, studying their injured feet with growing concern. The eldest woman, who would later introduce herself as Michaela McKenna, nodded weakly. "We'll try. But Sarah..." She gestured to the nearly unconscious young woman. "I'll carry her," Nathaniel decided, scooping the girl up as carefully as he could. "Lean on me, both of you. My cabin's about a mile back. We'll make it." The trek back was slow and grueling. The 2 women who could walk clung to his arms, their wedding dresses dragging in the snow, while he carried Sarah. The wind seemed determined to knock them down, and the temperature continued to plummet. Nathaniel found himself speaking more words than he had in months, offering quiet encouragement when one of the women stumbled, directing them around hidden obstacles beneath the snow. His mind raced with questions. 3 brides alone in the wilderness during the worst blizzard he'd seen in years? It made no sense. What desperate circumstances had driven them here? But questions could wait. Right now, his only priority was getting them to safety before the cold claimed them. Finally, through the swirling snow, the warm glow of his cabin windows appeared like a beacon. Nathaniel had never been so grateful for his habit of keeping a fire burning day and night during winter. The women's pace quickened at the sight, hope giving them strength for those final steps. As they stumbled toward the promise of warmth and shelter, Nathaniel felt something shift inside him, something he'd thought frozen solid years ago when he'd lost his wife. These women needed help, and somehow, fate or providence had placed them in his path. The mystery of their presence here could wait. For now, he had a purpose again, something beyond his daily rounds and lonely existence. The wind howled louder, as if protesting their escape from its icy clutches. But Nathaniel Porter's cabin stood strong against the storm, its windows glowing with welcome warmth, offering sanctuary to these strange brides who had appeared like ghosts in the heart of his wilderness. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them like a protective embrace as Nathaniel tended to their injuries by lamplight. His rough hands, usually employed for skinning game and setting traps, moved with surprising gentleness as he cleaned and bandaged their feet. The familiar scent of rabbit stew simmered on his wood stove, filling the single-room cabin with its homey aroma. The three women sat huddled near the crackling fire. Their sodden wedding dresses hung on a makeshift line nearby, dripping onto the wooden floor. Wrapped in Nathaniel's spare blankets, their shivering had finally subsided enough for coherent speech. "Much obliged for the care, Mr. Porter," the eldest woman said, her voice steadier now. "I'm Michaela McKenna. I taught, at the schoolhouse in Cedar Falls." Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the tin cup of hot tea he'd given her. "Maria Sandoval," the dark-haired woman beside her offered quietly. Her accent carried traces of both Spanish and Apache influence, and her eyes held a healer's knowing look as she watched Nathaniel dress their wounds. The youngest woman, who'd been barely conscious when they arrived, lifted her tear-stained face. "Melina Thompson. My father was..." Her voice caught. "Was the preacher in Cedar Falls?" Nathaniel noticed the past tense but didn't press. Instead, he focused on wrapping a clean strip of cloth around Maria's ankle. "Reckon you didn't end up in my trap by choice," he said carefully, keeping his voice gentle. "Though I've never caught three brides in my snares before." A choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, escaped Michaela's throat. "We were running from a fate worse than your trap, Mr. Porter." Maria placed a comforting hand on Michaela's shoulder as tears began rolling down the schoolteacher's cheeks. "Judge Hatch," Maria explained, her voice hardening on the name. "He decided he wanted Michaela for a wife, but not for love." "My uncle left me water rights," Michaela whispered. "Valuable ones. The judge ... She wiped roughly at her tears. "He threatened to have my students' families evicted if I refused his proposal." Nathaniel's hands stilled on the bandage. A familiar anger began burning in his chest, the kind he hadn't felt since his wife's death left him hollow 5 years ago. "Buck Garrison was after Maria's family's healing knowledge," Melina continued, her voice strengthening with righteous anger. "Said he'd have her relatives driven off their land if she didn't marry him." Maria's face remained composed, but her eyes flashed. "He cares nothing for our ways, only for profit from our medicines." "And you?" Nathaniel asked Melina gently. "Silas Crane?" She spat the name like it was poison. "He held the church's debts after my father died. Said he'd destroy everything Papa built unless..." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "They arranged it all together," Michaela explained. "A joint ceremony at the church. 3 convenient marriages to solve their problems and increase their power." Her fingers twisted in the blanket. We couldn't let them. "So we ran," Maria said simply. "During the final fitting of our dresses, straight into the storm. Better to die free in the snow than live caged by such men," Melina added, lifting her chin despite her tears. Nathaniel moved to stoke the fire, using the moment to master the rage building inside him. He'd left civilization behind after losing his Sarah, convinced there was nothing left for him but solitude. But hearing these women's story awakened something he'd thought long dead, a fierce need to protect, to make right what was wrong. He turned back to face them, his expression grave. "No one's dying in the snow," he said firmly. "You're safe here, all of you." He gestured to the howling storm outside. "That blizzard sealed off the mountain passes. No one's getting up here for days, maybe weeks. You can stay as long as you need." The relief that washed over their faces made his throat tight. These women had risked death to escape men who saw them as property to be claimed. The least he could do was offer them shelter. "The stew's nearly ready," he said gruffly, moving to check the pot. "Once you've eaten and rested, we can figure out what comes next. But for now," he looked each woman in the eye, "know that you're under my protection, such as it is." The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then Michaela spoke for them all, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. We won't forget this kindness." Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside Nathaniel's cabin, a fragile sense of safety began to take root. 4 souls, brought together by desperate circumstances, found themselves bound by a common cause as the winter storm sealed them away from the world below. The pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's frosted windows, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted floor. Nathaniel stood at his wood stove, the familiar rhythm of morning cooking bringing comfort after the shocking events of yesterday. The crackle of bacon in the cast-iron skillet mingled with the soft bubbling of coffee in the beaten tin pot. Behind him, the women moved carefully around the small cabin, their bandaged feet still tender. Maria expertly kneaded biscuit dough at the rough-hewn table, while Melina folded the blankets they'd used during their night on the floor. Michaela, her face drawn with worry, arranged tin plates and cups with the precise care of a schoolteacher. The storm had passed during the night, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Through the window, Nathaniel could see 3 feet of fresh snow blanketing everything in sight, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and pristine. The mountain passes would be blocked for days, maybe longer. "Breakfast's nearly ready," he announced, sliding the bacon onto a cracked platter. The biscuits Maria had shaped were browning nicely in the oven, filling the cabin with their homey scent. They gathered around the table, an unlikely group bound together by circumstance. Steam rose from the coffee cups as Nathaniel poured, the rich aroma cutting through the morning chill. For a few moments, there was only the quiet sounds of eating, forks scraping plates, coffee being sipped carefully. Michaela barely touched her food, pushing the bacon around her plate with trembling fingers. Finally, she set her fork down with a soft clink. "Mr. Porter," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something more you need to know, about why we ran." Nathaniel lowered his coffee cup, noting how Maria and Melina had gone still, their faces grave. "I'm not just a school teacher," Michaela continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My uncle, Jeremiah McKenna, She drew a shaky breath. "He left me his water rights when he died. All of them." Nathaniel's spine stiffened. Everyone in the territory knew of Jeremiah McKenna's vast water holdings. "The 3 main streams?" he asked quietly. "The ones that feed Cedar Falls Valley?" Michaela nodded. "The entire claim. It's worth—" She swallowed hard. "With the railroad companies pushing west, seeking water access for their steam engines, it's worth a fortune." "That's why Judge Hatch wanted to marry you," Nathaniel said, understanding dawning like the pale sun outside. "Yes, but it's worse than that." Michaela's voice strengthened with anger. "He had it all planned out with Garrison and Crane. Once we were married, he would alter the inheritance documents. They weren't just forcing marriages, they were stealing my legal claim." Maria reached over to squeeze Michaela's hand. "They used us as leverage," she said softly. "Threatened my family, Melina's church, all to ensure Michaela would comply. My father discovered something was wrong with the marriage records," Melina added, her young face hardening. "He died in an accident 2 days later." Nathaniel pushed back from the table, his appetite gone. He paced to the window, staring out at the pristine snow while his mind raced. This wasn't just about protecting 3 women from unwanted marriages anymore. This was about power, the kind of power that made men kill. "Whoever controls that water controls the valley's future," he said finally, turning back to face them. "The farms, the ranches, the railroad development, it all depends on those streams." "That's why we had to run," Michaela said. "They would have owned everything. used that power to drive out anyone who opposed them. Her voice broke. I couldn't let them do that to our community. The cabin fell silent except for the popping of the stove's fire. Nathaniel studied the three women, a schoolteacher with an inheritance worth killing for, a healer caught between cultures, a preacher's daughter seeking justice for her father. They'd risked everything to prevent corrupt men from stealing the valley's future. And now they were trapped here in his cabin with 3 feet of snow sealing them off from the world below. But when that snow melted, powerful men don't give up easy when there's money involved, he said grimly. And this is more than money, it's control. We know, Michaela replied softly. That's why we had to tell you the truth. You deserve to know the danger we've brought to your door. The morning light grew stronger, making the snow outside gleam like diamonds. Inside the cabin, 4 people sat with the weight of this revelation, knowing that everything had changed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about the future of an entire valley, about standing against the kind of men who would steal that future for their own gain. 2 days passed in a strange sort of peace at Nathaniel's cabin. The women fell into natural roles, Maria tending to their healing feet with herbs she'd found in Nathaniel's stores, Melina keeping the cabin tidy and organized, and Michaela teaching Nathaniel how to improve his reading using his worn Bible in the evenings. The routine felt almost domestic, despite the tension that hung in the air like wood smoke. The crack of splitting wood echoed outside as Nathaniel worked at the chopping block, keeping the stockpile high against the bitter cold. Inside, Maria stirred a pot of beans while Melina mended one of Nathaniel's old shirts. Michaela sat at the table, carefully copying out multiplication tables on precious paper for future lessons. The peaceful scene shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Nathaniel grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his body tense. Through the swirling snow, a lone rider appeared, slumped over his horse's neck. "It's Tom Whistle," Nathaniel announced, recognizing the young Ute messenger who often traded information for supplies. He hurried outside to help the half-frozen rider dismount. Tom's face was gray with cold, his lips blue. "Bad news from the valley," he managed through chattering teeth as Nathaniel helped him inside. The women quickly cleared space by the fire, and Maria pressed a cup of hot coffee into his trembling hands. "Judge Hatch and the others, they're coming," Tom said after taking a long drink. "They've organized a posse, saying the women stole money and jewelry from the church before they ran." He looked at Michaela with worried eyes. "Posted a $500 reward for their return." Melina gasped. "That's a lie, we didn't take anything." "There's more," Tom continued grimly. "They've branded you as a kidnapper, Nathaniel. Judge Hatch issued arrest warrants for all of you, and Buck Garrison, he's gathering his ranch hands for a manhunt." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. How are they explaining the forced marriages? Tom's expression darkened. They're telling everyone the women are hysterical, not right in their minds, making it sound like the marriages were meant to help them, like some kind of rescue. He shook his head in disgust. Most folks don't believe it, but they're scared to speak up, especially after what happened to Melina's father. Michaela sat down heavily, her face pale. "What about my uncle's water rights?" "They've already started filing claims," Tom replied. "Judge Hatch is arguing that your disappearance means the inheritance should revert to county control. And we all know who controls the county court." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Tom finished his coffee and stood, despite Maria's protests that he should rest longer. "I need to go before they notice I'm missing. They're watching everyone who might help you." Nathaniel pressed some dried meat and a handful of bullets into Tom's pocket. "Much obliged for the warning, friend." They watched from the doorway as Tom rode away into the swirling snow, his figure quickly swallowed by the white wilderness. The sanctuary of the cabin suddenly felt different, more like a fortress under siege. "They'll come up the mountain as soon as the snow melts enough," Nathaniel said, closing and barring the heavy door. He moved to the corner where his weapons were stored, beginning to check each one methodically. "We need to be ready." Maria and Melina huddled together by the fire, their faces drawn with worry. Michaela stood at the window, staring out at the endless white landscape that had seemed like salvation just days ago. Now it felt like a trap closing in around them. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, I've brought this danger to all of you." Nathaniel paused in his work, looking up at her. "You didn't bring this danger, Michaela. Those men and their greed did." He resumed checking his rifle's action. "And we're going to face it together." He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin's defenses, checking the heavy shutters, stacking extra firewood inside, moving supplies to better protected corners. The women helped where they could, their movements careful and precise, each lost in thoughts of what awaited them when the snow began to melt. As evening fell, they gathered around the table for a simple supper, the usual comfortable silence replaced by a tense watchfulness. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every whistle of wind made them start. Their enemies were out there waiting, plotting, turning their lies into weapons as dangerous as any gun. The cabin that had been their refuge now felt like the last fortress on a mountaintop, surrounded by forces gathering in the valley below. And sooner or later, the snow would melt. The harsh mountain winter kept its grip on the cabin for the next week, but within those snowbound walls, something remarkable began to unfold. What had started as a desperate alliance slowly transformed into genuine bonds of friendship and trust, forged in the quiet moments between survival tasks. Nathaniel, recognizing the women needed more than just shelter, began teaching them the vital skills of mountain life. In the crisp morning air, he showed them how to read the clouds for weather changes. "See those wispy mare's tails up high?" he explained, pointing to thin streaks across the blue sky. "Storms coming in 2 days' time." He demonstrated how to set rabbit snares with careful hands, showing them the precise way to loop the wire. Michaela proved particularly adept, her school teacher's attention to detail serving her well. By the fire each evening, he taught them to identify edible winter plants from his worn field guide, Maria adding her own knowledge of native flora. During one of these evening lessons, Michaela noticed how Nathaniel struggled with the plant names in his guide. His finger traced each word slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. She realized he could barely read. "Would you like help with that?" she asked gently. When he hesitated, she added, "You've taught us so much. Let me return the favor." Their lessons began that very night. Michaela used the legal documents she had memorized about her water rights as teaching materials. "These words might save all our lives one day," she explained, watching as Nathaniel slowly sounded out terms like riparian and appropriation. Maria's contribution to their growing family bond came through her healing knowledge. She noticed how Nathaniel favored his right shoulder, the result of an old trapping accident. From the dried herbs in his stores, she brewed special teas using her grandmother's recipes. "This will ease the deep pain," she said, handing him a steaming cup of willow bark and other herbs. The relief in his eyes when the medicine worked spoke volumes. Her skills proved truly vital when Nathaniel fell ill with pneumonia. One morning, he woke shaking with fever, his breathing ragged. Maria took charge immediately, sending Melina to gather snow for cool compresses while she prepared stronger medicines. "My grandmother taught me this blend fights the fever that settles in the lungs," she explained, mixing herbs with practiced hands. For 3 days, they took turns nursing him, Maria's traditional remedies slowly bringing his fever down. Without her knowledge, he might not have survived. Through it all, Melina brought another kind of healing. Each evening, she led them in prayer, her quiet voice carrying hope through the cabin. "We're not alone in this struggle," she would remind them. "We have each other and we have faith." She spent long hours talking with Nathaniel, especially during his recovery. One night, he finally spoke of his wife's death during childbirth, the guilt he'd carried for 5 years. "I should have gotten her to town sooner," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "Should have seen the signs." Melina took his hand. "You did everything you could with what you knew then," she said firmly. "Carrying this burden won't honor her memory." Her words, backed by genuine compassion, began to crack the walls around his heart. In return, Nathaniel became the steady, protective presence Melina had always longed for, but never received from her own father. Their evenings developed a comfortable rhythm. After supper, they would gather around the fire, sharing stories from their lives. Maria spoke of her grandmother's wisdom and her dreams of building bridges between cultures. Melina revealed her hope of becoming a minister despite the barriers facing women. Michaela described her uncle's vision for fair water rights that would serve all communities. Nathaniel mostly listened but occasionally shared tales of his early days in the mountains. His gruff exterior softened in the firelight, especially when his eyes met Michaela's. Their connection grew naturally, built on mutual respect and genuine understanding rather than the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. They became a family in those days, bound not by blood but by choice and trust. Each person's strengths complemented the other's weaknesses. Where one faltered, another stepped forward to help. Their shared purpose, surviving and fighting for justice, gave them strength, but it was their growing love for each other that gave them hope. Through these daily acts of care and teaching, they all began to heal. Nathaniel's isolation eased as he rediscovered the joy of human connection. The women's fear of their pursuers didn't disappear, but it no longer dominated their thoughts. Together, they found something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. They found home. The mountain winter had settled into a steady rhythm of snowfall and bitter cold as 3 weeks passed since the women's arrival. Inside Nathaniel's cabin, the unlikely family had begun to dare hope that they might remain safe until spring's thaw. That fragile peace shattered one morning with the sound of a horse's labored breathing and a weak pounding at the cabin door. Nathaniel opened it to find a young cavalry private slumped over his horse's neck, his uniform crusted with ice and his face blue from exposure. "Private James Miller," Nathaniel breathed, recognizing the boy he'd once helped rescue from a mountain lion. "Get him inside, quick." They carried the half-frozen soldier to the fire where Maria immediately began brewing her strongest warming tea. As feeling returned to his limbs, Private Miller's teeth chattered around urgent words. "Mr. Porter, I rode hard. Had to warn you, they've done something terrible." Michaela knelt beside him, wrapping another blanket around his shoulders. "What's happened in Cedar Falls?" The private's eyes were haunted. "Those men, they've taken it further than anyone thought possible. Judge Hatch filed papers in the territorial capital claiming you died in the wilderness, Miss McKenna. They're saying your body was found frozen in the snow." "What?" Michaela's face went pale. "But that's completely false." "They've forged all the documents," Miller continued, accepting a cup of hot tea from Maria with trembling hands. "Judge Hatch has already sold water access rights to 3 different railroad companies. He's collected thousands in fees, while Buck Garrison has claimed ownership of Cedar Creek itself, the main water source for the whole town." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "Those railroad contracts won't be worth the paper they're printed on once we prove Michaela's alive." "That's not the worst of it," Miller said, his voice dropping. "They've turned the territorial governor against you, Mr. Porter. They're saying you kidnapped these women for ransom, that you're holding them here against their will. There's a $1,000 bounty on your head." Melina gasped. "But that's ridiculous. He saved our lives." "Federal marshals are being sent to arrest you," Miller pressed on. "And a cavalry unit is already preparing to ride up here to rescue the women. They'll be here within days, as soon as the weather clears enough for horses to make it through." Michaela stood and began pacing, her teacher's mind working quickly. "We need the original inheritance documents. My Uncle Jeremiah left them somewhere safe, knowing something like this might happen. With those papers, we could prove everything." "But how can we possibly travel now?" Maria asked, looking out the frost-covered window at the deep snow. "The passes are all blocked, and with a manhunt underway—" Nathaniel ran a hand through his graying hair, his expression grim. "We can't stay here. Once the cavalry arrives, they'll arrest me and separate us. Those men will have you back in Cedar Falls before you can tell anyone the truth." "This is all our fault," Melina said softly, tears in her eyes. "Our escape has put you in terrible danger, Nathaniel." He shook his head firmly. "Number, those corrupt men made their choices. I made mine when I found you in that trap, and I don't regret it for a moment." His eyes met Michaela's across the room. "We'll find a way through this together." Private Miller struggled to his feet. "I need to get back before they notice I'm gone. But I had to warn you. You've done too much good for too many people out here for me to let them destroy you with lies." "Thank you, James," Nathaniel said quietly. "We won't forget this." After Miller departed, they gathered around the table, the weight of their situation pressing down like the snow on the cabin's roof. The corrupt men's scheme had escalated beyond anything they'd imagined. With forged death certificates, railroad contracts, and federal authorities involved, the net was drawing tight around them. "There has to be a way to reach those documents," Michaela insisted, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "There are only hope of proving what really happened." Nathaniel studied his worn map of the territory, tracing possible routes with his finger. But with deep snow blocking every pass and armed men searching for them, their chances of reaching the hidden papers seemed impossibly slim. The very mountains that had offered them sanctuary now felt like the walls of a closing trap. That night, the cabin's interior glowed with flickering lamplight as they gathered around Nathaniel's rough-hewn table, desperation hanging heavy in the air. Maps and scraps of paper covered the wooden surface as they searched for any possible escape route that wouldn't lead them straight into the hands of their pursuers. Maria sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea, watching the others debate various paths through the mountains. The weight of her secret had grown too heavy to bear. Finally, she set down her cup with a soft clink. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The others fell silent, turning to face her. Not all my Apache relatives were forced onto distant reservations. Some found another way to stay near our ancestral lands. Nathaniel leaned forward, his weathered face intent. "What do you mean?" "They married into the local Ute tribe," Maria explained, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "They live on the reservation, just 15 miles from here. My cousin Elena married a respected Ute warrior. She has influence with the tribal elders." Michaela's eyes widened. "The reservation... Wait." She pressed her hands to her temples, thinking hard. "My uncle Jeremiah, he was friends with the missionary there. He told me once he'd hidden important papers somewhere safe, somewhere the corrupt men in Cedar Falls would never think to look." Maria nodded. "The mission church, that's what made me remember. The tribal elders have their own quarrels with Judge Hatch and his kind over stolen water and land rights. They might help us, especially if Elena speaks for us." "But the reservation's 15 miles through deep snow," Melina said, wringing her hands. "With pauses searching every trail." "The mining tunnels," Nathaniel said suddenly, standing up to retrieve an older map from his trunk. He spread it carefully on the table, pointing to a complex network of lines drawn in fading ink. "I worked these tunnels in my younger days before I took up trapping. They run right through the mountain, coming out just a mile from the reservation boundary." "Are they safe?" Michaela asked, studying the maze-like pattern of tunnels. Nathaniel ran a hand through his graying hair. "Parts have collapsed over the years. Some might be flooded or blocked, but I know these passages. It's risky, but it's our best chance of reaching the reservation without being seen. The documents must be in Uncle Jeremiah's family Bible," Michaela said softly. "He always said he trusted God more than banks or lawyers. If we can reach that Bible, we can prove everything." They spent the next hour gathering supplies: lanterns, rope, dried food, extra warm clothing. Maria packed her healing herbs, while Nathaniel checked his weapons and ammunition. The gravity of their situation pressed down on them all as they prepared to leave the cabin that had sheltered them these past weeks. Melina stood by the window, watching snow fall in the darkness. "What if we don't all make it?" she asked, voicing the fear they'd all been holding inside. Nathaniel paused in his preparations, looking at each of them in turn. "We stay together. No matter what happens in those tunnels, we face it as a family." Maria touched the medicine pouch at her neck, murmuring a quiet prayer in Apache. "My people have a saying, the path of courage is never straight, but it leads true." They worked late into the night, packing only what they could carry through the narrow tunnels. Each of them knew that by morning, they would leave the relative safety of the cabin for a dangerous journey underground. Their only hope lay in reaching Elena and the tribal elders, finding the hidden documents, and proving their case before the federal marshals could arrest Nathaniel or the corrupt men could steal Michaela's inheritance. As they made their final preparations, the wind howled outside like a warning. The cabin's warm glow had been their sanctuary, but now it felt like a beacon that could draw their enemies. Tomorrow, they would descend into the dark passages beneath the mountain, betting everything on this desperate gambit to save not just themselves, but justice for the entire valley. The pale winter moon still hung in the sky as they prepared to leave Nathaniel's cabin before dawn. They deliberately trampled snow and left clear tracks heading toward the distant peaks, hoping to mislead any pursuers. Nathaniel shouldered his pack and held up the old miner's lamp, its weak flame barely pushing back the darkness. "The tunnel entrance is just beyond those rocks," he said, pointing to a shadowy outcropping. "Stay close. If anyone gets separated down there." He didn't finish the thought. They found the entrance partially hidden behind snow-laden branches. The rotting timber frame creaked ominously as they ducked inside. The temperature dropped immediately, their breath forming clouds in the lamp's glow. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, echoing through unseen passages. "Watch your step," Nathaniel warned, holding the lamp lower. "These old support beams aren't trustworthy." The first hour wasn't too difficult as they followed a main passage that still held its shape, but soon the tunnel began to narrow, forcing them to crouch and eventually crawl. Melina whimpered as the walls pressed in around them. "Keep breathing," Maria whispered encouragingly. "Focus on my voice." They encountered their first major obstacle 3 hours in, a partially collapsed section that left only a tiny gap near the ceiling. Nathaniel passed the lamp through first, then helped each woman squeeze through the narrow space. Michaela's wedding dress, still worn under her borrowed clothes, caught on a jagged timber. The sound of ripping fabric echoed like gunfire in the confined space. The next section brought them to their knees in icy water that had seeped through the mountain rock. They splashed forward, teeth chattering, unable to avoid getting soaked. Maria began humming an Apache melody, the sound giving them courage in the suffocating darkness. Hour after grueling hour passed as they pushed deeper into the mountain's heart. They ate dried meat and hard biscuits without stopping, knowing they couldn't afford to rest. The lamp's oil ran low, forcing them to conserve it for the most dangerous passages. Finally, after what felt like days but had been roughly 8 hours, Nathaniel held up his hand. "Fresh air," he whispered. "We're nearly there." They emerged from the mountain into late afternoon sunshine, blinking like owls. They stood on a forested slope overlooking the Ute Reservation's winter camp. Smoke rose from several lodges in the valley below. Maria led them carefully down the hillside, watching for patrols. As they approached the edge of the camp, a woman's voice called out in surprise. "Maria? Is it really you?" Elena, Maria's cousin, rushed forward to embrace her. She was dressed in traditional Ute clothing, her long black hair braided with beads. Her eyes widened as she took in their bedraggled state and the strange mix of people accompanying her cousin. "Quickly," Elena said in English. "Come to my lodge. You look half frozen." She hurried them inside a large teepee where a fire burned warmly. While they dried themselves and drank hot tea, Maria explained their situation in a mixture of English and Ute. Elena listened intently, her expression growing grave. "I will speak to the council," she said. "The elders must hear this story." Within an hour, they were brought before the tribal leaders in the council lodge. Chief Running Bear sat with quiet dignity, while Joseph Singing Wolf, the eldest of the council members, studied them through eyes that had seen nearly 8 decades of changes on the frontier. Michaela told their story, with Maria translating the more complex parts. She explained about her uncle's water rights, the forced marriages, and the corrupt men's schemes. The elders nodded with understanding when she described Judge Hatch's illegal activities. "These men have stolen our water as well," Chief Running Bear said through Maria's translation. "They build dams upstream and tell the Indian agent we are lying when we complain. They pressure the agency to reduce our lands, saying we don't use the water properly." Joseph Singing Wolf spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "When injustice grows too strong, all people suffer, white and native alike. Your uncle was a fair man who respected our ways. His water rights in your hands could protect many families." The council conferred briefly in their own language before Chief Running Bear announced their decision. "You will have sanctuary here. The Ute people will stand with you against these corrupt men. Your fight is our fight." That evening, the tribe welcomed them with a feast. Traditional songs filled the air as food was shared and stories exchanged. Elena wrapped them in warm blankets made by tribal women. A medicine man offered blessings for protection, touching each of their foreheads with sacred herbs. For the first time since fleeing the forced marriages, they felt truly safe. In this unexpected sanctuary, surrounded by new allies who understood their fight for justice, they could finally rest and begin planning their next move. Morning sunlight filtered through the mission church's weathered windows, casting warm patterns across the simple wooden pews. Father Miguel's wrinkled hands trembled slightly as he led them through the quiet sanctuary toward the vestry. His black cassock was worn but clean, speaking to his decades of humble service on the reservation. Jeremiah McKenna was more than just a friend, Father Miguel said, his Mexican accent softened by years of speaking English. He saw the corruption growing in Cedar Falls and feared for his niece's future. He unlocked the vestry door with an iron key that hung from his rope belt. The small room smelled of candle wax and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, holding church records and sacred items. Father Miguel moved directly to a locked cabinet in the corner. Inside sat an ornate family Bible, its leather cover decorated with silver crosses. "Your uncle brought this to me last spring," the priest explained to Michaela. "He said some men were asking too many questions about water rights. He trusted the church more than banks or lawyers." Michaela ran her fingers over the Bible's worn cover. "I remember this from his study. I never knew he'd hidden it here." Father Miguel carefully opened the heavy book. Between its pages, protected by thin sheets of oiled paper, lay several official documents with territorial seals. Michaela's hands shook as she examined them. "These are the original water rights," she breathed. "Look at the signatures and seals. Everything's here, properly witnessed and recorded." Her eyes moved rapidly across the legal text. 3 major streams, their tributaries, water access points. Uncle Jeremiah documented everything perfectly. Nathaniel leaned closer, squinting at the formal writing. Thanks to Michaela's patient tutoring, he could now make out many of the important words. These would stand up in any honest court? Any honest court, Michaela confirmed. She pointed to dates and signatures. "But look here, these official stamps are from last year. And here's a notation about new claims being filed." Her voice hardened. "Judge Hatch was already altering copies of these documents months before he tried to force me to marry him." Father Miguel nodded sadly. "Jeremiah suspected as much. He told me corrupt men were trying to steal what belonged to his family, and to the whole valley. That's why he hid the real documents where greedy men wouldn't think to look." Maria and Melina exchanged hopeful glances. For the first time since their desperate escape through the blizzard, they felt real hope. With these papers and the tribe's support, they had a chance to expose the corruption. "We should get these somewhere safe," Nathaniel said, helping Michaela carefully wrap the documents. But before they could move, running footsteps echoed through the church. A young Ute scout burst into the vestry, breathing hard. He spoke rapidly to Maria in his native tongue. Maria's face paled as she translated. "Federal cavalry has reached the reservation boundary. Captain Morrison and his men are demanding to search every building." "How many soldiers?" Nathaniel asked sharply. "A full company, at least 60 men." Maria continued translating. "Judge Hatch has convinced the territorial governor that we're starting an Indian uprising. He claims we stole property and the tribe is harboring dangerous criminals." Father Miguel's aged face grew stern. "They cannot enter a house of God without proper authority." "They have authority," Maria said grimly. "Written orders from the territorial governor to search everything and arrest anyone protecting the fugitives. The scout says we have maybe 1 hour before they reach the mission." Michaela clutched the documents to her chest. "All our proof of the judge's corruption will mean nothing if they arrest us first. He'll make sure these papers disappear forever." Nathaniel moved to the vestry's small window, scanning the reservation grounds. "We need a plan, fast, if they find us here." The gravity of their situation settled over the group. Outside, the winter sun continued to climb higher, marking the precious minutes until the cavalry arrived. They had found their crucial evidence, but now they had to figure out how to protect it, and themselves, from 60 armed soldiers who believed they were criminals. Father Miguel crossed himself and whispered a quiet prayer. The scout shifted anxiously by the door, waiting for instructions. Their hour of grace was already slipping away. Captain Morrison sat straight-backed on his horse, his weathered face stern beneath his cavalry hat, as he faced Chief Running Bear outside the Tribal Council Lodge. 60 soldiers formed an intimidating line behind him, their rifles gleaming in the winter sunlight. The captain's hand rested casually on his holstered pistol, a gesture not lost on the tribal leaders who stood proudly beside their chief. "I have orders from the territorial governor himself," Morrison declared, holding up an official document. "You're harboring dangerous criminals, including a kidnapper named Nathaniel Porter. My men will search every building on this reservation." Chief Running Bear stood tall, his ceremonial blanket draped with dignity across his shoulders. "These people you seek came to us for protection from true criminals, men who abuse law and steal what belongs to others." "I fought Indians in 3 territories," Morrison said coldly. "I've seen how rebellion starts. Judge Hatch warned us that Porter has been turning your people against proper authority. Don't force me to treat this as an uprising." The threat hung heavy in the crisp morning air. Behind the soldiers, several men held torches, making their intentions clear. They would burn the reservation buildings if met with resistance. Inside the mission church, Nathaniel and the women huddled near the altar with Father Miguel. Through the windows, they could see soldiers establishing a perimeter, cutting off all escape routes. The weight of responsibility pressed down on them like a physical burden. "We can't let them hurt these people," Maria whispered, thinking of her cousin Elena and the families who had welcomed them. "The tribe took us in when we had nowhere else to go." Michaela clutched the precious water rights documents. "If we surrender, Judge Hatch will destroy these papers. Everything we've fought for will be lost." "And they'll separate us," Melina added softly. "Send us back to those men who tried to force us into marriage." Nathaniel's face was drawn with concern. His hands, calloused from years in the mountains, clenched into frustrated fists. "These good people gave us sanctuary. Now our fight for justice could bring violence to their doorstep." Father Miguel lit several candles on the altar, their warm light a stark contrast to the cold reality outside. "Let us pray together," he said gently. "In our darkest moments, God's light shows the way." They knelt together on the worn wooden floor, surrounded by simple wooden pews and the familiar scents of beeswax and incense. The old priest's voice rose in both Spanish and English, asking for guidance and protection. Melina's clear voice joined his, drawing on the deep faith that had sustained her through their ordeal. "Remember David before Goliath," she said with quiet intensity. "Sometimes God's plan requires us to stand firm against impossible odds. He doesn't promise an easy path, only that he will walk beside us through the darkness." "Amen," Maria whispered, reaching for Michaela's hand. Through the windows, they could see more soldiers arriving, establishing firing positions around the mission. Captain Morrison's voice carried clearly as he issued ultimatums to the tribal leaders. "You have 1 hour to surrender the fugitives and any stolen property," he shouted. "After that, we'll search every building by force. Anyone who resists will be arrested for conspiracy." Nathaniel moved to the window, watching as soldiers with torches took up positions near the church's wooden walls. The threat was clear. They would burn this house of God if necessary to flush out their quarry. "What do we do?" Michaela asked softly, the documents heavy in her hands. "How can we choose between saving ourselves and protecting these innocent people?" They gathered closer together near the altar, the dancing candlelight casting long shadows on the whitewashed walls. Outside, the cavalry formed a tightening noose around the mission. Inside, 4 unlikely fugitives and an elderly priest faced a decision that would affect not just their lives, but the future of an entire community. Father Miguel touched the silver cross at his throat. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that test not just our courage, but our faith in God's greater purpose." Through the windows, they could see Chief Running Bear and the tribal elders standing firm against the line of soldiers. The morning sun climbed higher, marking the precious minutes until the captain's ultimatum expired. The impossible weight of their choice pressed down on them as they knelt together in the little church, seeking guidance in prayer while time slipped steadily away. Just as Captain Morrison raised his hand to signal the advance, a clear voice rang out from the church doorway. "Captain Morrison, I request to speak with you privately." Melina Thompson stepped into the morning light, her hands raised high. Her torn wedding dress gleamed white against the dark wood of the church, and her face showed both fear and determination. The captain hesitated, then lowered his hand. "Hold position," he ordered his men. Something in the young woman's bearing, dignity mixed with desperate courage, caught his attention. "I am Melina Thompson," she announced, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "Daughter of Chaplain Robert Thompson, the territorial chaplain. I have information you need to hear." Morrison's expression shifted at the mention of the chaplain's name. He dismounted and approached her cautiously. Chaplain Thompson was a good man. His death last year was a great loss to the territory. "Please, Captain, what I have to tell you must be heard in private." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. Inside the church." They entered the mission's small vestry, where Melina closed the door and faced the captain. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her courage. "My father wasn't just a frontier preacher," she began. "As territorial chaplain, he performed and recorded every official marriage ceremony for government officials. He kept detailed records, dates, witnesses, locations, everything." Morrison's brow furrowed. "Go on." "Before he died, my father discovered something terrible. Judge Cornelius Hatch, the man who sent you here, was already legally married to a woman in Kansas City." Melina's voice grew stronger. "Any subsequent marriage would be bigamous and invalid under territorial law." The captain's eyes widened. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" Melina reached down and began working at the hem of her wedding dress. The heavy white fabric had been carefully altered, creating a hidden compartment. From it, she withdrew a leather-bound journal and several official documents, all bearing her father's neat handwriting and official seals. "My father's complete ceremonial records," she said, laying them on a small table, "including witness statements and marriage certificates that prove Judge Hatch married Catherine Blackwood in Kansas City in 1882. He's still married to her now." Morrison leaned forward, examining the documents with growing concern. "This means all his legal actions involving marriage contracts are fraudulent," Melina finished, "including his claims on Michaela McKenna's water rights inheritance. That's why he tried to force her into marriage, to steal her property through a false union that would never have been legal." She pulled out Michaela's inheritance documents found earlier in the family Bible. These prove Michaela's rightful ownership of the water rights. Judge Hatch has been forging documents and manipulating the law to steal what belongs to others. The captain's face darkened as he read through the papers. "Your father was investigating this corruption?" Melina nodded, her voice catching. "He died suddenly, right after telling me he'd discovered something terrible. I always suspected—" She couldn't finish the thought. Morrison straightened, his military bearing now tinged with anger. "I've been manipulated into threatening innocent people to protect a criminal's scheme." He looked at Melina with new respect. "You've been carrying these records all this time?" "In my wedding dress," she confirmed. "I knew they'd be important someday. I just didn't know how important until now." The captain gathered the documents carefully. "This evidence needs to reach the territorial capital immediately. You'll all need to come with me, you, Porter, and the other women. I'll provide an armed escort to ensure you arrive safely and can present your case to honest authorities." "You believe us?" Melina asked softly. Morrison's weathered face softened slightly. "Your father was an honorable man, Miss Thompson. These records bear his signature and seal. And now I understand why Judge Hatch was so eager to send military force against a small group of supposed fugitives. He wasn't afraid of criminals. He was afraid of the truth you carry." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father would be proud of your courage today. You may have saved many lives by speaking up." Melina blinked back tears as she followed him out into the morning light, where soldiers and tribal members alike waited anxiously to learn their fate. The weight of her father's final mission, carried so long in secret, was finally lifting from her shoulders. The morning sun cast long shadows across the territorial capital's granite steps as Captain Morrison led Nathaniel, Michaela, Maria, and Melina into the imposing government building. Their small group, still wearing trail-worn clothes, drew curious stares from well-dressed officials hurrying through the marble halls. Governor William Hayes received them immediately in his wood-paneled office, his expression grave as Captain Morrison made the introductions. The Territorial Attorney General, James Morton, joined them, spreading the documents across the governor's massive oak desk. "These records are extraordinary," Morton said, examining Chaplain Thompson's marriage registry. "Judge Hatch's existing marriage to Catherine Blackwood is thoroughly documented. Multiple witnesses, official seals, even a newspaper announcement from Kansas City." Governor Hayes leaned forward, his face reddening as he studied the evidence. "And these forged death certificates for Miss McKenna, created while she was very much alive. The audacity is staggering." "There's more, sir," Captain Morrison added, describing how Judge Hatch had manipulated him into threatening military action against innocent people. "They tried to use federal forces to cover up their crimes." Michaela stepped forward, her voice steady. "My uncle's water rights inheritance was legally registered and witnessed. Judge Hatch knew he couldn't challenge it directly, so he planned to steal it through a fraudulent marriage, which would have been invalid regardless given his existing marriage," Morton noted, shuffling through more papers. "The railroad contracts alone show the scale of this conspiracy. 3 different companies paid substantial fees for water rights that Judge Hatch never legally controlled." Governor Hayes stood abruptly, pacing behind his desk. "I was deceived by their reports of Indian unrest and kidnapping. They used my office to perpetrate this fraud." He turned to his secretary. "Send for Federal Marshal Collins immediately. I want arrest warrants for Judge Cornelius Hatch, Buck Garrison, and Silas Crane. Charges of criminal conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of office." The secretary hurried out as Morton continued examining documents. "The territorial bank records show suspicious transfers between all 3 men dating back months. They've been planning this scheme for quite some time." "Miss McKenna," Governor Hayes said, facing Michaela directly, "I hereby declare all documents claiming your death to be invalid. Your water rights inheritance is officially restored, effective immediately." Tears welled in Michaela's eyes as Nathaniel placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Maria and Melina embraced her from either side. "Captain Morrison," the governor continued, "I want your full report on how they attempted to manipulate federal forces. That will be crucial evidence in their prosecution." "Yes, sir," Morrison replied, "and I recommend all charges against Mr. Porter be immediately dismissed. He's no kidnapper. He saved these women's lives." "Agreed," Hayes said firmly. "Mr. Porter, you are fully exonerated. In fact, you deserve the territory's gratitude." Within hours, federal marshals rode out to arrest the conspirators. Judge Hatch was taken into custody at the Cedar Falls courthouse, his protests dying on his lips when shown the proof of his bigamy. Buck Garrison attempted to flee but was captured at his ranch, while Silas Crane surrendered without resistance. The news spread rapidly through telegraph offices across the territory. By afternoon, representatives from the railroad companies arrived, demanding immediate refunds of their water rights payments. Other victims of the corrupt men's schemes began coming forward. Ranchers who'd lost land through suspicious foreclosures, native leaders who'd seen treaties violated, families who'd been threatened into silence. "Their entire house of cards is collapsing," Morton told the governor as reports continued arriving. "Once we started pulling threads, the whole web of corruption began unraveling. They'll face decades in federal prison." Governor Hayes turned to the 4 who had exposed the conspiracy. "You've done this territory a great service. Your courage in standing up to these men, at great personal risk, has opened the door for others to seek justice." Nathaniel spoke for the first time since entering the governor's office. "We just wanted to protect what was right, sir. These women showed more courage than any man I've known." "And you showed us that not all men abuse their power," Michaela replied softly, meeting his eyes with warmth and gratitude. They emerged from the government building into bright afternoon sunshine, their long nightmare of persecution finally over. Justice had prevailed, their names were cleared, and the corrupt men who had threatened them would face punishment for their crimes. The territory itself seemed lighter, as if a dark cloud had lifted from the land. Spring blossoms dotted the Colorado Territory's mountain slopes as warm sunshine melted the last patches of winter snow. 3 months had passed since justice prevailed over corruption, and remarkable changes had transformed both the landscape and its people. In the newly rebuilt Cedar Falls schoolhouse, morning sunlight streamed through tall windows as Michaela McKenna stood before a classroom filled with children from every background imaginable. Apache children sat beside the sons and daughters of white settlers, while Mexican and Ute students worked together on their reading lessons. The sound of young voices reciting in unison filled the fresh-painted room. "Miss McKenna?" A small Ute girl raised her hand. "Can you tell us again about the water-sharing agreement?" Michaela smiled, gesturing to the large map on the wall showing the territory's rivers and streams. "The water belongs to everyone," she explained. "Just like the sunshine and the air we breathe. That's why we created the Cedar Falls Water Council, where tribal elders and town leaders work together to ensure every family and farm has fair access." Maria Sandoval, who taught traditional medicine and cultural studies, entered with a bundle of fresh herbs for their afternoon lesson. The children's eyes lit up. They loved learning about healing plants from both native and settler traditions. "The old walls between our peoples are coming down," Maria said later as they watched the children playing together at recess. "Each child who learns to see beyond differences helps build a stronger future." Across town in the whitewashed territorial church, Melina Thompson adjusted her newly earned minister's collar before stepping up to the pulpit. The pews were filled with faces from every community, a sight that would have seemed impossible just months ago. As the territory's first female preacher, she had faced initial resistance, but her unwavering faith and demonstrated courage had won over even the most traditional church authorities. "Love knows no boundaries," she proclaimed, her voice carrying to the back rows. "When we open our hearts to understanding, miracles become possible." Later that afternoon, she performed a marriage ceremony for a young couple, a Ute warrior and a Mexican trader's daughter, their union symbolizing the territory's growing unity. At the base of the mountains, Nathaniel Porter's cabin had evolved from a hermit's refuge into a sanctuary for travelers and those seeking justice. New rooms had been added, and a constant stream of visitors brought news and fellowship to the once isolated homestead. Nathaniel, no longer the grief-haunted recluse, worked alongside Ute tribal members to maintain safe trails and protect vulnerable travelers. "Never thought I'd see such changes," he remarked to Michaela as they sat on the cabin's expanded porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in gold. Their own wedding was planned for the coming month, with Melina to perform the ceremony and Maria preparing traditional healing blessings. The Ute reservation flourished under the new water agreements. Chief Running Bear and the Tribal Council worked directly with territorial authorities, their protected water rights ensuring bountiful crops and healthy livestock. The ancient tensions between native and settler communities began to ease as cooperation replaced conflict. "My uncle would be proud," Michaela said, watching children from the reservation school playing with their Cedar Falls friends near the shared stream. "He always said water could divide people or bring them together. It was our choice which path to follow." The transformation wasn't limited to Cedar Falls. Word of their success spread throughout the territory, inspiring other communities to examine their own prejudices and corrupt practices. The former runaway brides had become leaders in a peaceful revolution, proving that courage and compassion could overcome even the deepest divisions. The mountain stream sang its eternal song as spring sunshine warmed the expanded homestead that had grown from Nathaniel Porter's once lonely cabin. 1 year had passed since 3 desperate women in wedding dresses had stumbled into his bear trap during a blizzard. Now, on this perfect Colorado morning, that same property hosted a gathering that would have seemed impossible during those dark days. 3 wedding arches stood beside the flowing water, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons in the traditions of multiple cultures. Beneath the vast blue sky, families from every background in the territory spread blankets on the fresh grass. Apache elders in traditional dress sat beside Anglo settlers in their Sunday best, while Mexican grandmothers chatted with Ute women as children darted between the groups playing tag. Nathaniel stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, now a proper home with additional rooms and a wraparound porch, watching his wife Michaela direct the final preparations. They had married 6 months ago in the mission church, where they'd found both the legal documents that saved them and the allies who helped bring justice to the territory. Now they were hosting another celebration of love. 3 couples who had found each other through the integrated school and ministry the women had established. "Everything is ready," Michaela said, joining him on the porch. Her simple calico dress was a far cry from the mud-stained wedding gown she'd worn during their escape, but her eyes held the same determination that had helped transform the entire region. Father Miguel took his place beneath the central arch, his weathered face beaming as Melina Thompson joined him, her minister's collar gleaming in the sunlight. Maria Sandoval moved gracefully between the gathering families, translating customs and ensuring every tradition was honored in the ceremony to come. The school children, dressed in their finest, assembled in front of the arches, their young voices lifted in song, first in English, then Spanish, followed by Apache and Ute verses. The music floated across the gathering like a promise of the future they were building together. Captain Morrison, resplendent in his cavalry uniform, sat in a place of honor beside Chief Running Bear and the tribal council. The officer's presence represented more than just federal authority. He symbolized how justice had triumphed over corruption when good people chose to stand together. The wedding feast laid out on long tables showcased the richness of their integrated community. Apache fry bread beside Anglo biscuits, Mexican tamales next to Ute berry preserves. The sharing of food represented the sharing of lives and cultures that had replaced the old divisions. As the ceremonies began, Maria stepped forward to explain each tradition to the gathered families. The first couple exchanged vows in Spanish and English. The second incorporated Apache blessing rituals, and the third included traditional Ute prayers. Father Miguel and Melina worked together seamlessly, ensuring each union was blessed according to both territorial law and sacred customs. Chief Running Bear rose to offer a blessing in his native tongue, which Maria translated with reverence. The territorial governor's representative followed with official recognition of the marriages, demonstrating how formal authority now worked in harmony with tribal leadership. The mountain stream that had once been the source of bitter conflict now provided a peaceful backdrop to the celebration, its waters flowing freely for all thanks to the fair agreements Michaela had established. Children played along its banks without regard for the boundaries that had once divided their peoples. As the sun began its descent behind the peaks, casting long golden rays across the gathering, Nathaniel slipped his arm around Michaela's waist. Together they watched their extended family celebrate. Apache grandmothers teaching Anglo children traditional dances, Ute elders sharing stories with Mexican youth, former enemies breaking bread together as neighbors and friends. "Who would have thought," Nathaniel murmured, "that 3 scared women in wedding dresses could change so much?" Michaela leaned against his shoulder, watching the newly married couples begin their first dances. "It wasn't just us," she said softly. "It was everyone who chose hope over fear, justice over greed, love over hatred. We just had to be brave enough to take the first step." Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.